joining us for the PY20 monitoring webinar in preparation for the upcoming monitoring season. We're going to kick off our first review the week of August 30th and monitor through mid-April. So obviously we're approaching that timeline. But today we'll get into a fairly high-level overview of the monitoring process and go through the changes to the compliance portion of the monitoring review. Every year we, tweak this process to ensure that we have a robust review that covers any updated requirements from the federal and state levels. And our goal with this training is to make sure that everyone is prepared for the monitoring season to kick off at the end of August. So just so everyone's aware, we did send out the tools to the local directors, but again, with this presentation, we wanted the opportunity to go over changes to the process and tools and take any questions that you all might have. I do want to note that we will not be showing the monitoring tools on this webinar, as they're fairly bulky and it would be a little difficult to navigate in this setting. But again, the tools have been sent out to LWDA leadership for you all to review ahead of your monitoring visits. So to kick us off, I would like to introduce the compliance team. Thanks to COVID, we've not had the opportunity to see you all for some time, but these names and faces should be familiar to many of you. We have our senior compliance specialist, Dayon Woods, Melly Napolitano, and Karen Abrin. We do also have an open position that will be posted soon, and we'll be onboarding a new compliance member at some point during the season. So we'll introduce that individual once they get hired on, but if you see a new face, it'll be that person. We'll let you guys know when they start. Of course, I'm Brittany Walsh, the compliance director, and we will get started. If you have any questions, the compliance team monitors a shared email address that we've included here. So if you ever need us, you can give us a shout at weoacompliance@tcsg.edu. So to start us off, I'll be covering the what and why of monitoring. We'll talk a little bit about the format and process changes for the upcoming monitoring season, and then I'll hand it over to Dayon Woods to cover some of the other process changes and changes to the compliance monitoring tools. So why do we monitor? Obviously, this is an integral part of our oversight responsibilities as required by law. But even more than that, this process helps us to identify areas of concern in operation and just gives us a better understanding of the activities going on across the state. Our goal for monitoring is for these reviews to be quality assurance checks and not just, a checklist of, do you have X, Y, and Z policy or process in place? We want to be looking at local operations for general effectiveness and, offer recommendations to improve processes where we see opportunities for improvement. Of course, this is an opportunity to correct deficiencies, but we also want to highlight best practices. We see various areas encountering certain challenges that maybe other areas will have, and so we'll kind of pull whatever their process is to correct that challenge or address it, and share that with other areas to, maybe improve the system as a whole and give those recommendations based on other areas' experiences. Additionally, as we've grown the WorkSource Academy, we believe that we're better positioned to offer even more technical assistance and guidance to you all. And those technical assistance or training topics can come to us in a variety of ways. One is obviously, when you all identify issues and bring that to our attention. But then also, as we encounter issues in monitoring, we want that to carry over into our technical assistance. And in addition to any required corrective actions that we may issue you guys in findings, we want to make sure that any trainings we offer kind of address the bigger picture that led to any of the issues that we saw. Just to cover the basics of monitoring, again, I know many of you are very familiar with this process, so I'll just hit the high points. This is obviously an annual process carried out by 3 teams at the Office of Workforce Development. We have programs, finance or grants, and compliance. So usually it is just a 3-person team that comes out to monitor you all. But sometimes when monitors are in training, there may be additional staff. And I just like to mention this ahead of time. So, local staff aren't worried if more state folks show up. It's not for any reason other than usually someone's in training The only other time you'd have more staff there is if an area is high risk. That just increases the amount of samples that we look at. And so sometimes we'll send an extra person just to make sure that we're making the best use of our time, and that we can wrap up that review, by the Friday of the monitoring visit. So each team creates a risk assessment, and these obviously differ slightly, but generally all of the risk assessments include prior year findings and observations, the amount of award or size of award that the local area gets, any suspected fraud, of course, and that means an open OIG investigation or some sort of open OWD desk review. Additionally, we'll look at changeover in leadership, both within the local area, as well as at least compliance looks at changeover in your board leadership. And then another criteria we look at is if an area uses subrecipients. So there are more criteria, and again, these differ between the teams, but generally those are the criteria that we're looking at. And this risk assessment is what determines the amount of samples we select for each area. So again, each team pulls different things, and I'll let each of them talk about that in their presentations regarding monitoring, but just to give you an overview, that's how that part of the process works. So preparation for the monitoring visit begins about a month ahead of the review. And this includes obviously a data request for all the items our teams need to review. And once all of those items are received from the local area, our team will review the files to ensure that everything is there, and then reach out with any additional document needs. So if anything's missing, we'll let you know that. Or if we need additional information that wasn't requested originally, we'll communicate that as well. So again, each team's process is slightly different, but a portion of the review will occur as a desk review ahead of the monitoring week. So again, you may start receiving communication from the monitoring team requesting additional information in the weeks leading up to your review. And that information will usually come from the team lead for your monitoring visit. This is just a person that has been designated as the main point of contact for a local area during the review. We want to make sure that we're not bombarding you all with communication from all sides and all teams. So usually we have one person who sends out that information. A majority of our process while we're on site is following up on any missing information or documentation and just asking some general questions in addition to the interviews that we've conducted that we're conducting on site. And again, a lot of the review will happen as a desk review ahead of time so that we can come to you all with any lingering questions and just make the best use of our time and your time during that monitoring week. Once the monitoring week concludes, we enter the corrective action period. And this period can depend on each of the areas and what findings we identify. Usually we like to wrap it up within a month or two of the monitoring visit. However, we do recognize that some findings may take longer to resolve if they require board approval or have to go through another lengthy approval process. So we set those due dates as appropriate considering those factors. And if things come up on your end, we will always take that into consideration. If you propose a due date to us, we'll consider that before we issue the formal due date and just make sure that we're considering all those factors. One last thing that I wanted to cover about monitoring in general before we move on to changes is to just quickly reiterate the definitions of a finding versus an observation. So a finding is a situation in which a federal, state, local rule, regulation, or policy is not being satisfied. Whereas an observation is something or a situation where a program or process improvement would strengthen local operations. Each situation is different and depending on the issue may require a different approach to resolve. We try to craft the required actions of a finding to address the specific issue we identify, but also to generally put in place processes that bolster your local process in a way that can hopefully avoid the same issue in the future. Again, something may not reach the level of a finding, and so we may make it an observation and just kind of offer recommendations for ways that you could improve the issue. Sometimes it may not even reach the level of an observation, and we'll maybe give you a, a verbal notice or send it in an email just saying, hey, we noticed this issue, we suggest this to resolve, or just make sure that it's on your radar, and maybe something that we would follow up with technical assistance or additional training. And again, sometimes things may not rise to the level of a finding or an observation, and we always try to find ways to come to a satisfactory conclusion to resolve any issues. And again, we'll work with you all on crafting those required actions and making sure that what we put in place truly resolves the issue and is something that works for you all. So moving on to changes, as always, there are changes that we make between last year's monitoring and the upcoming season. So just wanted to mention a couple of these really quickly. You'll see here that we have added a portion of the review that covers the National Dislocated Worker Grant, the COVID grant that we have. So as a condition of that grant from USDOL, we obviously have to monitor the activities under the grant. And the easiest way to do this was to just incorporate it into our annual monitoring. So we've added a review of COVID grant case files, as well as a review of contracts related to the grant. So in this training, each team is covering changes to their part of the monitoring process, and I'll let programs and finance cover the specifics of that in their portion, but I just wanted to mention it here that we're incorporating that into our process this year. The other change for this year that I wanted to mention is something hopefully no one will encounter this year, but obviously some findings we issue can result in a disallowed cost. And this, the most common way that this happens is if finance issues a disallowed cost for something like period of performance, or programs will issue one for, related to missing documentation. And so when it comes from a missing documentation finding, we've put together a one-pager that explains the process for submitting that payment, and what information is needed to verify the amount that we've disallowed. And then that one pager kind of explains the process for where and how to remit that payment. Again, disallowed costs are pretty rare, and I don't anticipate that we'll need this for many areas at all. But because there has been some confusion in the past about how this part of the process works, we've put together these, this ready-made guide to kind of streamline that process and just ensure that payments don't get lost or sent to the wrong division of TCSG. So we'll have that just in case your area encounters that. We'll send that out with our report. I'm going to hand it over to Dan Woods to cover the rest of the changes for the PY20 process, as well as the compliance changes. So Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Brittany. Continuing with the virtual submission process, you will receive a link by email from the compliance team with information on how to upload your documents to Dropbox when you receive your monitoring package. Please label the documents appropriately so it's easier to find once uploaded in the folder. The data request list and tool will look a little different as we try to streamline part of the process and make it easier for LWDAs to submit documents. Some items were removed from the Word document titled Data Request to the Document Directory tab in the Excel file titled Data Request Tool. Some of those items include board bylaws, meeting minutes, conflict of interest forms, and the most current active MOU. Thinking back in time, you may remember what an actual on-site visit may entail. Surprise! OWD is going back to physical on-site monitoring visits. Just as it was done prior to PY20, the entrance and exit conference will be virtual. Before the monitoring visit, you'll receive a virtual conference invite to connect for the entrance conference. Please note that we are now requesting an LWDB representative to attend the entrance, and I will give further details as I mention the tool changes later. All teams, which will include the compliance, programmatic, and finance team, will be on site Tuesday and Wednesday. If additional time is needed, teams may need an additional day and may possibly be on site Thursday. Finally, on Thursday, you should receive another virtual invite for the preparation to close out on Friday. Now let's discuss some of the compliance tool changes. Previously in the internal controls tool, there were questions involving a lot of finance that caused overlaps in compliance and finance interviews. Finance will be testing those items to avoid duplicated questions. The internal control questionnaire has been updated to reflect tool changes, therefore decreasing the amount of questions the LWDA has to fill out ahead of time. As a way to alleviate any extra work for LWDAs on the front end, this year there isn't an MOU questionnaire. If additional information is needed after reviewing the MOU, those questions will be addressed during the interviews. In regards to the EO tool, there weren't any significant changes. As I stated before, there is a reason why we are now requesting the attendance of a board representative. This person can either be the board liaison, board chair, or board member. We will still evaluate local workforce development boards for attendance, vacancies, sunshine provision, etc. But this year, we are also looking at the general order and flow of meetings, role of the board chair, and general board engagement. We anticipate this new focus will not result in findings around board engagement, but rather is an opportunity for us to gather information on how boards operate and understand the general successes and struggles of the boards to provide insight for training and technical assistance. We may offer recommendations to improve board operations, not necessarily as an observation, but a verbal suggestion or highlight notable practices. Finally, the Leo board tool has a new question in regards to verifying the Clio election process, if applicable. That's all I have for you today. Let's get ready for a successful monitoring season this year.